It sounds backward at first. San Diego is a coastal desert city in the driest corner of California, a place with almost no water of its own that must import nearly everything it drinks from hundreds of miles away. Salt Lake City sits at the foot of the towering Wasatch Mountains, beneath peaks that catch some of the deepest snow in the American West. In a state that prides itself on its mountain water. By any casual reckoning, the mountain city should be the safe one, and the desert city the doomed one. But when you actually run the water math, when you look past the appearances at the underlying structures of supply, demand, and vulnerability, a different and more troubling picture emerges. San Diego, the water-poor coastal city, has built itself a future. Salt Lake City, the water-rich mountain city, is racing toward a reckoning it is only beginning to confront. This is the brutal math that explains why the desert city will survive and the mountain city may not. At least not in the form it knows today. And it is a story about how water security depends far less on how much water a place appears to have than on what it does with it and what forces are bearing down on it. The desert city that planned begin with San Diego, because its story is the more hopeful one and it sets up the contrast. San Diego faced, decades ago, a terrifying reality. It depended almost entirely on imported water, and much of that water came through a single wholesale supplier and ultimately from sources, the Colorado River and Northern California, over which the city had little control. In a drought or in a dispute, San Diego could find its lifeline squeezed, and it learned this lesson painfully during past water crises when its supply was threatened and it realized how dangerously exposed it was. That fear became the mother of an extraordinary effort because San Diego resolved never to be that vulnerable again. And it set about diversifying its water supply with a determination that has made it one of the more water-secure cities in the arid Southwest, precisely because it started from a position of such insecurity. What San Diego did was to build a portfolio. It invested heavily in securing independent supplies of water so that it would not be at the mercy of a single wholesaler or a single source. It pursued large-scale water recycling, treating wastewater to a high standard so it could be reused rather than lost. It built major seawater desalination, turning the one thing it has in endless supply, the Pacific Ocean at its doorstep, into drinking water, an expensive but drought-proof local source. It conserved aggressively, driving down per-person water use through efficiency, the removal of thirsty landscaping, and changes in how water is priced and used. And it secured long-term agreements to bring in water it could count on. The result is that San Diego, the city that once trembled at its own vulnerability, has assembled a diversified and increasingly drought-resistant water supply, spreading its risk across many sources so that the failure of any one does not threaten the whole. San Diego will survive, not because it is water-rich. It is not. But because it confronted its scarcity early, took it seriously, and built the infrastructure and the habits to withstand it. It ran the brutal math on itself, did not like the answer, and changed the answer through decades of investment and planning. That is the deep reason for its resilience. The mountain city that assumed now turned to Salt Lake City, and the contrast begins to sharpen, because Salt Lake City's water story has been, for most of its history, the opposite of San Diego's, a story not of anxious planning against scarcity, but of comfortable assumption of abundance. Salt Lake City grew up beneath mountains that deliver a bounty of snow, and that snowpack, melting through the spring and summer, has long fed the streams and reservoirs that supply the city with clean, plentiful mountain water. For generations, this arrangement worked so well that water could be taken largely for granted, an abundant gift from the mountains that seemed as reliable as the seasons themselves. Salt Lake City did not have to build desalination plants or fight desperate battles for imported supplies, because the water fell from the sky onto the peaks above it and flowed down to the city below. But this very abundance and the assumption it bred is the root of the vulnerability, because the mountain water that Salt Lake City has relied upon is now under threat from forces that the city is only beginning to reckon with, and it has not built the kind of diversified resilience that San Diego constructed out of necessity. When your water has always come easily, you do not develop the infrastructure, the habits, or the urgency of a place that has always had to fight for every drop. Salt Lake City sits in a rapidly growing region, one of the fastest growing in the nation, its population swelling, and its demand for water climbing, all while it leans heavily on a snowpack-fed supply that a warming climate is beginning to undermine. The comfortable assumption of mountain abundance, which served the city so well for so long, has left it less prepared than it needs to be for a future in which that abundance can no longer be assumed. This is the first turn of the brutal math. The city that appears water-rich has built its life on an assumption that is now failing, while the city that knew it was water-poor built defenses that are now paying off. The snowpack that is slipping away at the heart of Salt Lake City's vulnerability is the snowpack, and understanding why the snowpack is slipping away is essential to grasping the brutal math. Salt Lake City's water comes overwhelmingly from the snow that accumulates on the mountains through the winter and melts through the warmer months, feeding the streams and filling the reservoirs. This system depends on a particular pattern: cold winters that build a deep snowpack, and a gradual melt that releases the water over the spring and summer when it is needed. But the warming climate is disrupting this pattern in ways that strike directly at the reliability of the supply, and this is the deep physical threat to the mountain city. As temperatures rise, several things happen, all of them bad for a snowpack-dependent city. More of the winter precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, which runs off immediately instead of being stored in the snowpack for later release. The snow that does fall melts earlier and faster, shifting the timing of the runoff away from when it is most needed and complicating the capture and storage of the water. And warmer conditions mean more of the water is lost to evaporation and absorbed by thirsty, dry soils before it ever reaches the streams and reservoirs. So that even a decent snow year can yield a disappointing amount of actual water. The connection between how much snow falls and how much water reaches the city has weakened, so that the supply grows less reliable and, over the long term, diminishes for a city that depends so heavily on this single mechanism: mountain snow melting into its reservoirs. The warming climate is a direct and mounting threat to the foundation of its water supply. And unlike San Diego, Salt Lake City has not built a diversified portfolio of alternatives to fall back on. It remains deeply tied to the snowpack that is slipping away. This is the physical core of the brutal math. A warming climate is undermining the mountain water that the city assumed would always be there, and the city has few alternatives to turn to. The Great Salt Lake is vanishing, but there is a second dimension to Salt Lake City's crisis, one that has no parallel in San Diego, and that adds a dramatic and even existential edge to its predicament. The Great Salt Lake, the vast saline lake that gives the city its name, is drying up, and its decline poses threats that go beyond water supply into the realm of public health and environmental catastrophe. The Great Salt Lake is fed by the same rivers and streams that draw from the same snowpack and watersheds the city and the region depend upon. And as more and more of that water has been diverted for use by the growing population and by agriculture, and as the warming climate has reduced the inflows, the lake has been shrinking dramatically, its level falling to historic lows and vast stretches of its bed becoming exposed. The drying of the Great Salt Lake is not merely a loss of a scenic and ecological treasure, though it is that. It is a looming public health and environmental disaster that threatens the entire region around Salt Lake City. As the lakebed becomes exposed, it reveals vast plains of dry sediment, and that sediment contains dust and, in places, toxic materials including arsenic and other harmful substances that have accumulated in the lake over time. When the winds blow across the exposed lakebed, they can pick up this dust and carry it into the air over the city and the surrounding communities, creating the potential for serious air quality crises and health hazards for the large population living nearby. This is a threat of a different order than a simple water shortage, a slow-motion environmental catastrophe unfolding on the doorstep of a major metropolitan area, driven by the same forces of overuse and warming that threaten the water supply. The shrinking of the lake also disrupts the local climate and ecology, harms the industries and wildlife that depend on it, and represents a profound destabilization of the environment in which the city exists. No comparable threat looms over San Diego. The desert city faces water scarcity, but it does not face the prospect of a toxic dust bowl blowing off a dying lake into its neighborhoods. The Great Salt Lake crisis is a uniquely Salt Lake City danger. And it is a central reason the brutal math turns so sharply against the mountain city. The growth that compounds the crisis layered on top of the snowpack decline and the dying lake is the relentless growth of the region, which compounds every element of the crisis and makes the brutal math more unforgiving. The Salt Lake City region has been among the fastest growing in the United States. Its population expanding rapidly as people pour into the area, drawn by its economy, its quality of life, and its opportunities. This growth is in many ways a sign of the region's success, but it collides head-on with the water crisis, because every new resident adds to the demand for water at exactly the time when the supply is threatened and the lake is dying from too much water being taken. The growth compounds the crisis in multiple ways. It increases the total demand for water, pressing harder on a supply that is already under threat from the warming climate and the declining snowpack. It intensifies the competition for the water that feeds the Great Salt Lake, drawing more of it away for human use and accelerating the lake's decline. And it does all of this in a region that, because of its history of assumed abundance, has been slower than places like San Diego to develop the conservation habits and the diversified infrastructure needed to accommodate growth within a shrinking supply. The collision of rapid growth with a threatened and shrinking water supply is a recipe for crisis, and it is unfolding in real time around Salt Lake City. San Diego, too, must manage growth, but it does so from a position of hard-won water security, with a diversified supply and a deeply ingrained conservation culture built over decades of confronting its scarcity. Salt Lake City must manage its growth from a position of assumed abundance now revealed as vulnerability, with a supply under mounting threat and a signature lake drying up. The growth that would be a challenge for any city becomes, for Salt Lake City, an accelerant of a crisis it is only beginning to grapple with. The trap of the single source there is a structural insight at the center of this comparison that deserves to be named directly. Because it is the engine of the entire brutal math, the danger of the single source. Salt Lake City, for all the apparent richness of its mountain water, is fundamentally a single-source city, dependent overwhelmingly on one mechanism, snowpack melting into its reservoirs, for the water that sustains it. When a city rests on a single source, its fate is tied with absolute tightness to that source. And if the source falters, the city has nowhere else to turn. This is precisely the vulnerability that San Diego, starting from its own dangerous dependence, works so hard to escape by building a diversified portfolio. The cruel twist is that a single source that has always been reliable is the most dangerous kind of all, because its very reliability breeds the complacency that prevents diversification. A city whose single source frequently failed would be forced to build alternatives. A city whose single source never failed sees no reason to. Right up until the moment the source begins to fail under new and unfamiliar pressures. This is Salt Lake City's trap. Its mountain snowpack was so dependable for so long that the city never developed the alternatives it now desperately needs, and by the time the snowpack began to slip away under the warming climate, the city found itself with no diversified portfolio to cushion the blow. Meanwhile, the same shrinking source is starving the Great Salt Lake, turning a water supply problem into an environmental and public health catastrophe as well. San Diego, forced by early insecurity to abandon its own single-source dependence, spread its risk and built its cushion. Salt Lake City, lulled by a reliable single source, did not, and now faces the reckoning that diversification exists precisely to prevent. The trap of the single source is the deepest structural reason the brutal math turns against the mountain city. The deeper meaning of diversification steps back, and the brutal math resolves into a single, powerful principle that explains the divergent fates of the two cities. Water security depends not on apparent abundance, but on the diversity and resilience of a city's supply, and on how seriously it has prepared for scarcity. San Diego and Salt Lake City are, in a sense, mirror images. The desert city, poor in water, was forced by its very poverty to build resilience, to diversify, to plan and invest and conserve, and that hard work has bought it a secure future. The mountain city, rich in water, was lulled by its very abundance into assuming that the water would always flow, and that comfortable assumption has left it exposed now that the forces of climate and growth are undermining the source it took for granted. This is a lesson that reaches far beyond these two cities, because it reveals a counterintuitive truth about water in an age of change, that having plenty of water can be a kind of trap, breeding a complacency that leaves a place unprepared, while having little water can be a spur to the foresight and investment that builds true security. The places that appear most secure may in fact be the most vulnerable, if their security rests on an abundance that is slipping away. And the places that appear most vulnerable may in fact be the most secure, if their scarcity drove them to build the resilience that a changing climate demands. San Diego ran the brutal math on itself long ago, did not like the answer, and spent decades changing it. Salt Lake City is only now beginning to run that same math, discovering far later than it should have that the answer is more alarming than its mountain abundance ever led it to believe. The gap between the two cities is not a gap in how much water they have. It is a gap in how they have prepared, and in an age of climate change, that preparation is everything. Can the mountain city change course? None of this means that Salt Lake City is doomed, and it is important to be fair and honest about the fact that the mountain city can still change course, that its predicament, while severe, is not beyond response if it acts with the seriousness the crisis demands. The brutal math is brutal precisely because it exposes a dangerous trajectory. But a trajectory can be altered by determined action, and there are signs that Salt Lake City and the state of Utah are beginning to awaken to the danger, particularly the crisis of the Great Salt Lake, which has galvanized real attention and concern. The path forward would require Salt Lake City to do, belatedly, what San Diego did decades ago, to take its water vulnerability with deadly seriousness, to conserve far more aggressively, to rethink the patterns of water use that assumed abundance made possible, and above all to leave more water in the rivers and streams so that enough reaches the Great Salt Lake to halt and reverse its decline. This is an enormous challenge because it means confronting the entrenched demands of agriculture, which uses the largest share of the region's water, and the pressures of relentless growth, and the deeply ingrained habits of a place that never had to worry about water before. It means changing a culture as much as building infrastructure. Whether Salt Lake City can rise to this challenge in time remains an open and urgent question, and the stakes could hardly be higher. Because the fate of the water supply, and the fate of the drying lake, and the health of the entire region all hang on the answer. The city has the knowledge it needs. The science is clear. What remains uncertain is whether it can summon the will and make the hard choices before the crisis deepens beyond easy repair. San Diego's example proves that a vulnerable city can build security, but San Diego had decades and a head start born of early fear. Salt Lake City has less time and is starting later, which is exactly why the brutal math weighs so heavily against it, even as the possibility of a different future remains genuinely open. The warning and the comparison in the end, the comparison of San Diego and Salt Lake City, is a warning, and its lesson extends to every city and region trying to understand its own water future in a changing world. The warning is that appearances deceive, that the apparent security of abundance can mask a deep vulnerability, and that the true measure of a place's water future lies not in how much water flows through it today, but in the resilience of its supply and the seriousness of its preparation for a future that will look nothing like the past. San Diego will survive because it understood this and acted on it, transforming itself from one of the most vulnerable cities in the region into one of the more secure. Salt Lake City faces a far harder road because it assumed its abundance was permanent, and it now confronts a shrinking snowpack, a dying lake, and a booming population all at once, with far less of the resilience it needs. This does not mean the mountain city cannot save itself. It means it must now do quickly and under pressure what the desert city did gradually and by foresight, and that the window for doing so is narrowing. The brutal math is a call to action, a reminder that in an age of climate change, no place can afford to assume that its water will always flow as it has, and that the cities which thrive will be those which, like San Diego, confront their vulnerabilities honestly and build against them relentlessly. While the cities which struggle will be those which, like Salt Lake City for so long, mistook abundance for security and delayed the reckoning until it arrived on its own harsh terms. The desert city beside the ocean will survive because it planned for scarcity. The mountain city beneath the snow may not, unless it learns, and quickly. The lesson its arid neighbor learned long ago, that water security is never given, only built, and that the time to build it is before the crisis comes, not after. That is the